headlines in the killing of Surrey Sikh temple leader Hardeep Nijjar. Nijjar was gunned down on June 18th last year outside a Sikh temple in Surrey. He was a prominent leader of the Sikh separatist movement, publicly campaigned for Khalistan, the creation of an independent Sikh homeland in the Punjab region of India. Was this a political assassination on Canadian soil by India? I got Rob Dhanu standing by to discuss. Have a listen to David Tabul here from the BC RCMP announcing, this was at the Bombshell news conference last week, announcing the arrest and charges against 3 men from India in this case here. We just had the first court appearance this morning in Surrey. Have a listen to Dave Tabul, BC RCMP here.
There are separate and distinct investigations ongoing into these matters, certainly not limited to the involvement of the people arrested today. And these efforts include investigating connections to the government of India.
Okay, massive investigation underway, still continuing. 3 men from India accused in this case made a court appearance today. Security very, very tight there, as you can imagine. Let's discuss now with my guest, Rob Dhanu. Rob is a former federal Crown Prosecutor, criminal defense lawyer, co-founder of Dhanu Dhaliwal Law Group. Rob, thank you for coming on today.
Pleasure to be here, Mike.
Okay, I appreciate it a lot. And today we saw the first court appearance here by these 3 men. Security very tight here. There was a protest outside the courtroom. Rob, there's going to have to be massive security here around this case going forward, correct?
Absolutely correct. This is an absolutely unprecedented and complicated security situation, Mike. You know, gangs are notoriously difficult to infiltrate for law enforcement to begin with. And although we've learned a lot over the years, we see that gangs are still able to operate with relative impunity. You have killings and you don't have these murders being solved. Now we're adding layers of complexity here, and I'll mention 3 layers really. And the first is that these 3 individuals are not only allegedly tied to local gangs, but also internationally all the way back to Indian gangs. So in particular, we have this Lawrence Bishnoi group. And so we're looking at something that's now international in scope, which makes it even more difficult to deal with because you're dealing with an unknown quantity. So we have some understanding of local gangs. We have little understanding of foreign gangs, including the level of violence that they're prepared to resort to. And we saw that example out in Alberta where we had this killing of an alleged gangster and an 11-year-old child. That's an escalation of violence we don't typically see in Canada. So the question is that because we have this foreign gang involvement? There's a number of questions that are going to be in the RCP's mind in relation to things like that.
This is an absolutely wild case, especially when you consider the allegations and suspicions that the government of India may have been behind it. And when you talk about this alleged hit squad that may have been hired here, I mean, this is what do you think of that idea, that concept that the Indian government could be hiring these type of maybe hitmen here? Have a listen to Dan Stanton here. He's a former executive with CSIS, Canada's national spy agency, commenting on this, and then we'll discuss. Have a listen to this.
They need to reach out to some unsavory characters, and then there's the security of the operation isn't very good because it could already be compromised by Western intelligence, or who knows, you can get someone who's indiscreet.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like such a very risky play here if it does turn out that there was any kind of Indian state involvement. Rob, your thoughts?
Well, it increases the complexity big time, Mike. So we have to take a step back and understand why the Indian government would become involved in the first place. And that takes us back to this whole fight for an independent Sikh homeland back in India, or Khalistan as they call it. Yeah. Now, the peak of that conflict was the Air India bombing. Then it really simmered down for a number of years. But what we're doing now is we're involving or intermixing gang conflict from Canada, related all the way back to India, with the religious conflict and sentiment. So in terms of what's going on behind the scenes, Lawrence Bishnoi, who's this gangster back in India who's in custody there, he's publicly sided with the Indian government. Meanwhile, we have this other individual, Sukhdev Gill, who was killed in Winnipeg, allegedly by individuals linked to the people who are now in custody for the Nijjar murder, and he's linked to the Khalistan Tiger Force, which is pro-Khalistan. So you have this religious sentiment, this intermixing with gang involvement. Then you add a third factor, which is possible state involvement in terms of the Indian government. And that is the real security wildcard here, because Corrections is used to dealing with security concerns from local gangs, and they understand that to a large extent, and they'll separate these individuals in custody. But what corrections and law enforcement is not used to dealing with is an entire nation state possibly being involved, and what their motivations may be, or to the extent that they will go to achieve their goals.
Yeah.
So, for example, will they employ other sleeper agents? We can bet that this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going on behind the scenes. So these are not the only three individuals who would have links back to the Indian government if that is the case. What this means is that these security issues require coordination between corrections, RCMP, CSIS, and into America, FBI, the CIA. Unfortunately, this is not the type of coordination that the institutions like corrections are necessarily used to dealing with. And when you have so many chefs in the kitchen, mistakes can be made.
Yeah, man, talking to Rob Dhanu about the latest stunning developments here in the killing of Surrey Sikh temple leader Hardeep Nijjar. You know, when you think about as well, here's one of the other big questions that's erupted here, Rob, is how did we got 3 men charged here, Indian nationals, questions being raised in Ottawa now. How did these 3 men get into Canada in the first place? Now, there are widespread media reports that they may have entered Canada as international students on student visas. Let's listen to Federal Immigration Minister Mark Miller. Now, he was asked about this yesterday, very, very cautious in his responses, and he said he didn't want to comment specifically in this Nijjar case, but he was asked generally, when you bring in an international student into Canada, hang on a second here now, aren't you supposed to do background checks on these guys? Have a listen to this.
Generally speaking, if someone were on a student visa, would there be criminal record checks?
Yes.
There would be?
Yeah.
And then how does that process work?
You check them, and if they have a criminal record, they don't come in.
You check them, and if they have a criminal record, they don't come in. Rob, there are some unanswered questions here about how these men got into Canada in the first place, right?
Absolutely. Well, the question is, how do you check them, right? So certainly there are criminal record checks when individuals come to this country, and if you have a record, you're typically denied entry into this country. But when you're dealing with foreign countries where there's a higher level of corruption, the question is, where are these record checks originating from? What is the document? Is it a real document? Is it a fake document? So it's not that we don't do record checks. It's to what extent do we actually examine whether that record check is accurate or not?
Yeah. Yeah, boy, there are so many layers to this thing, and I think it's going to get more complicated going forward. Here's another one. There are calls to investigate links to this murder to state actors from India. And what about consular officials here in Canada? We saw in the immediate aftermath of this, Canada expelled a consular official from India, sent him back to India. So there are calls now, well, wait a minute. Was Indian consular officials in Canada in any way linked or involved in this? And here's the other question here. What about diplomatic immunity here for these officials? Let's listen to this. You'll hear Global News reporter Jeff Semple here and also Rob Curry from Dalhousie University. Have a listen.
Even if the RCMP has evidence of Indian government involvement, its consular officials are protected by diplomatic immunity.
The uncomfortable truth is that a foreign diplomat who might have participated in a serious crime cannot be charged, they cannot be detained or arrested.
Okay, is this going to introduce yet another complex level into this case, Rob? Your thoughts?
Well, it absolutely can, but the problem is once you've sent these diplomats back home, good luck getting them back into the country if you are going to prosecute something, and it will require the involvement of the Indian government. And so far, the Indian government has really been very reluctant to acknowledge anything with regard to this case. The Indian government had a very different response when it came to the U.S. when they alleged that Nikhil Gupta was involved in plots similar to the Nijjar plot, but Canada is a much smaller player on the global stage, and I think we're getting a very different reaction from India as compared to the United States.
Rob, thank you for your expertise and your analysis today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Rob Dhanu there. Rob's a former federal Crown Prosecutor. He's a criminal defense lawyer, co-founder of the Dhanu Dhaliwal Law Group. Always appreciate his time. We take a final break on the show. On the other side, we've got a memorable moment from today's show that is coming up in the mic drop, and